All right, we'll get started. Thank you for joining us today for the first in a series of webinars focused on tax opportunities for tribes under the Inflation Reduction Act. My name is Molly Melius, and I run the Lawyers for a Sustainable Economy initiative here at Stanford Law School, which is putting on the webinar today with the help of Paui Rivera, White House Senior Advisor and Director of Tribal Affairs, along with tax experts from the law firm Holland and Knight. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. The presentation portion is being recorded today, but not the Q&A. You can submit questions in writing using the Q&A feature at any time. But because we are not recording that part, we are going to respond to the Q&A after the presentation. After the webinar today, I will share the slides and along with additional information about some comment deadlines on the current regulations for direct pay and additional information about future webinars and focus group sessions. The goals today for this webinar are two. The first, to help educate and answer questions for tribal entities engaging with the Inflation Reduction Act. And two, to provide information for tribal entities on how to obtain direct pro bono legal assistance from the law firms in the initiative, for folks who are interested in taking advantage of the funding flowing from the Inflation Reduction Act. See here, my screen is frozen, so that's always good. The Lawyers for a Sustainable Economy initiative supports tribal communities, nonprofits, and early-stage entrepreneurs working on sustainability matters or hoping to access Inflation Reduction Act opportunities by connecting them with firms that are offering pro bono legal help. The initiative was launched back in 2018 at the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco with the help of my colleagues at Stanford, a few of the founding law firms, former Governor Brown, former California Attorney General. And now there are 17 major private law firms in the initiative who have provided pro bono legal help to over 120 startups and nonprofits as part of their overall dedication of $80 million in pro bono help to support sustainability matters on matters both inside and outside the initiative. So today we are excited to be kicking off our webinar series focused on these tax opportunities for tribes. And we're honored to be joined by Paui Rivera, Senior Advisor to the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs and Director of Tribal Affairs for the Biden-Harris administration, who will provide context on this huge legislation. Paui has focused his career on democratic political efforts and tribal engagement, holding many campaign advisor positions and working at the Democratic National Committee for many years, including as the DNC's National Native American Engagement and Finance Director. Prior to the DNC, Paui served as a government relations advisor working with tribal governments on federal public policy and political affairs. After Paui's remarks, the Holland and Knight team, who collectively have decades of experience in tribal and tax law and policy, will be presenting additional substantive information on the IRA, as well as fielding questions from the audience. You will hear a little bit more about the Holland and Knight team later from Beth Viola, Senior Policy Advisor and Chair of the firm's Energy and Natural Resources Industry Sector Group. So with that, I will hand it over to Paui.
Thank you so much, Molly, and to the Stanford's Lawyer for a Sustainable Economy initiative for organizing this important session today, and to all of you for being here. I want to give us a shout out to Holland and Knight for all the technical expertise that they'll walk you through later in today's information session. We know that tribal communities are on the front lines of the climate crisis and that the escalating hurricanes, fires, floods, and heat waves that we're seeing year after year are disproportionately affecting your homes and your native lands. President Biden came into office with a vision to tackle the climate crisis by investing in our economy and our communities, and we're turning that vision into a reality with the Inflation Reduction Act. It's the biggest investment in climate action history, with $369 billion to cut harmful pollution, bolster our climate resilience, and invest in clean technologies across the power sector, transportation, buildings, industry, and agriculture. And it puts President Biden's goal of halving our emissions over the next 7 years reaching 100% clean power by 2035 and getting to net zero by 2050 within reach. The Inflation Reduction Act is nothing short of historic, and we're all here today because we want to turn this historic law into results for Indian country. The law provides more than $720 million for climate, clean energy, and conservation programs dedicated to tribal lands and native communities, and tribes are eligible for billions in other grants, loans, and rebate programs. That includes dozens of programs from the federal agencies represented across the administrations, and you'll hear more from them as we progress through the year. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, is also investing $2.6 billion in coastal resilience funding, including to support tribal priorities like fisheries. The Department of Agriculture is currently accepting applications for expanding clean energy and electrification through rural electric utilities to help agricultural producers and rural small businesses invest in clean energy, to help farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners integrate climate smart conservation into working lands, and so much more. All told, the grant and loan programs in this law will help tribes install clean energy and create good paying jobs. They'll help Native families access affordable, reliable electricity. They'll grow tribal energy sovereignty and independence, and they'll make Indian country more resilient to the impacts of the climate crisis. But believe it or not, the real prize of the Inflation Reduction Act is something completely different: the 2/3 of the law spending that runs through the tax code. The Inflation Reduction Act establishes 10 years of tax credits for clean energy, meaning that companies or groups that install solar, wind, geothermal, or other clean energy technologies can get certain percentage of their costs back. Those 10 years of policy certainty have unleashed a clean energy revolution. In the first 9 months after the legislation was passed, we saw more than $100 billion in new clean energy investments from the private sector. And certain bonus credit programs are going to benefit Indian country because they incentivize responsible clean energy development in low-income communities and energy communities. But the tax portions of the law aren't just relevant for companies. The Inflation Reduction Act allows tribes and other non-taxable entities to receive money back on their clean energy investments instead of getting tax credits. The mechanism is commonly known as direct pay. Direct pay is one of the ways the Biden-Harris administration is starting to correct a legacy of federal energy programs that have been inaccessible to Native communities for far too long. The Inflation Reduction Act seeks to change that. This law has the power to keep the lights on for more Native families, to create good-paying, high-quality jobs for tribal members in industries of the future, and to bring clean, resilient, affordable, clean energy to Indian country. We want to make sure that these investments reach our communities. It's why we created a new tribal guidebook for the IRA to help you navigate this new law. And it's why we need your feedback and engagement. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to the Holland and Knight team to walk you through some of the more technical pieces of the legislation and to answer any questions that you may have. But you may find the IRA Tribal Guidebook on cleanenergy.gov that'll walk you through all the tribal programs and the provisions that tribes are eligible for. So with that, I'll turn it over to Beth to introduce the Holland and Knight team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paui. We're delighted to be here and partner with Lawyers for a Sustainable Economy for this series of webinars. Holland and Knight has both a robust Native American law team and an energy tax team, making our colleagues uniquely qualified to present at this webinar today. Joining us today is Amish Shah, Nicole Elliott, and Ken Parsons, who combined have years of experience in this area. I am confident that you're going to find their presentation quite informative. Just as a reminder to everyone, we are going to be doing today an overview of the IRA, and the goal is to orient you to the tax opportunities it presents. We have then scheduled 2 additional webinars that will go a little bit deeper into the issues. The next one is scheduled for August 28th at the same time, and will focus on direct pay. And the second, which will be September 25th, will focus on the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. As Paui mentioned, The IRA provided significant opportunities for tribes, both through direct funding and especially through the tax code in a way that's never been done before. These webinars are going to focus on leveraging the benefits that were provided in the tax code. The Holland and Knight team, my colleagues, are going to provide you with a general overview of many of the tax provisions that may apply and then talk through direct pay. As was mentioned, direct pay is going to be the mechanism by which tribes are able to leverage the incentives in the IRA. I want to mention that we are intentionally leaving a lot of time for questions and answers today. We have found that many webinars rush through a lot of content, and we wanted to ensure that we went a little lighter on the content so that there will be plenty of time for everyone to answer your questions. And just as a reminder, to ask questions, please populate the chat box. We will hold them until the end and review at that point. And with that, let me turn it over to Amish.
Great. Thank you, Beth. And thank you all for joining us today. I think one of the themes already that has come about is the Inflation Reduction Act, or what we refer to as the IRA, is historic. And the incentives that are provided for developing solar, wind, and other clean energy projects, and those incentives are available through the income tax code, are very significant. And we'll get into more detail on this as we go along, but just to give you a sense of how significant they are, in many cases, the government will cover between 30 and 70% of the capital costs of projects through these tax incentives. So they are a big driver of what we're seeing as a huge upflow and uptick in the development of clean energy and related projects. So when we talk about what is new, the government has long incentivized clean energy through the Internal Revenue Code. We've had tax credits for solar and wind and clean fuels for decades now, and we've been working with clients on those for decades. So why is the IRA so transformational? And Pawe and Beth alluded to those. We're going to talk about a few of the reasons over the next little bit. We're going to talk about a few of the reasons why it's so transformational. The first is it expanded the numbers and types of tax credits and the period over which these are available, so that we have certainty, as Pawe said, for a long time that these tax credits will be available. And so we'll talk first about those tax credits. Second, it provides opportunities for groups that couldn't previously take advantage of those tax credits, including tribes, and we'll talk about the direct pay mechanisms. And then we'll also talk about one of the third big reasons, which is it provides for these additional bonus tax credits, and it adds some new requirements that are intended to provide not only climate change benefits, but also societal benefits as well. So we'll discuss each of those in turn. So let's start first with some of the tax incentives provided for in the Inflation Reduction Act. And we've broken these out into general categories here. And I think these categories show how expansive these credits really are. So first are tax credits related to energy manufacturing. And the idea here is that if you build or make substantial upgrades to a manufacturing facility, and the manufacturing facility has to be located in the United States, and you produce components that will be used in clean energy projects, that you can be entitled to one of these two tax credits. And so the idea here is to increase the manufacturing capabilities in the US of components that are needed to actually build solar or wind or other clean energy facilities. And these credits come in two forms. The first is what we call the Section 45X tax credit. Well, tax lawyers have to, on occasion, talk in Internal Revenue Code sections. We'll try not to do it too much, but it's important sometimes to talk in that shorthand, because that's the way folks are thinking about this, even non-tax lawyers. So the first is the 45X tax credit. And so what that does is it provides a credit for that's based on how much of a clean energy component you produce. So how many batteries you produce, how many solar panels you produce in the US. And it's tax credit based on that, and that you can just claim if you're doing the relevant activity. But that is only for specified types of products that you produce in the US. But there's a more expansive version of that, which is the 48C credit, and that's available for a much broader array of items that are manufactured in the US. And that's a credit not based on how much of something you produce in the US, but based on how much you spend to build a manufacturing facility, or to re-equip a manufacturing facility, or to upgrade a manufacturing facility. And one of the interesting things about that credit that's very unique is that most of the credits we're going to talk about today, if you do the activity, if you build the solar project, if you build the wind project, and you meet all the requirements, you can simply go claim the tax credit. This 48C tax credit is one of the few in the tax code where you have to go ask the IRS for an allocation and for the right to be able to claim the tax credit. And so there's a process around that. We just finished some work around that, which was a very substantial lift, but there are more opportunities to take advantage of that. So the short of it is, if you're building manufacturing facilities in the US, we need to be thinking about the energy manufacturing credit. The second is a clean vehicles credit. And so this is, again, a credit that's been available for quite a while for electric vehicles. And generally, the credit's been available to purchasers of electric vehicles. The credits have been changed, they've been expanded, they've been revised. One of the challenges under the old rules was that each manufacturer had a limit on how many cars they could produce for which the credit would be available. And that limit is now gone away, but there are new requirements that are in place. At this point, I'm not going to get into all of the new requirements because there are a lot of nuances around how the new requirements work and when they work and how they work. But the short of it is, there are still opportunities to get tax credits for buying EVs and other clean vehicles. Carbon sequestration, this is something that's been in the code since 2008. It's been in the code since 2008. It was expanded in 2018. And what this does is, this is what we're going to talk about here is a standalone tax credit, but there are bits and pieces of this carbon sequestration credit that fit into various other tax credits. And so something we just want to generally be thinking about here, which is, what this is it's an incentive in the tax code to take carbon dioxide that would otherwise be emitted in the atmosphere. So if we think of any sort of an industrial facility, a manufacturing facility, an electric generation facility, including, for example, a coal generation facility that's emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. What this credit is doing is it's saying, if you're otherwise going to emit CO2 in the atmosphere, and you take the CO2 and you capture it, and there's equipment that's available currently to capture CO2. If you capture it from those emissions, and then you store it either deep underground or use it for certain commercial purposes, like putting it in concrete, that you can get a tax credit for it. And so what they're incentivizing in the tax code is taking CO2 that was otherwise be released in the atmosphere and taking it and storing it underground or storing it somewhere so it's not released in the atmosphere. And so again, there are opportunities to do that to the extent you have industrial facilities otherwise. If we go to the next slide. So next is one I think is probably something that a lot of folks have thought about. I mean, as you go around the country, we see a lot of wind facilities, we see a lot of solar generation facilities, and those have been incentivized through two big tax credits: the investment tax credit under Section 48 and the production tax credit under Section 45. And again, the difference between those two, and generally you can choose between the two, but the difference is that a production tax credit is available for the first 10 years that a project is operational, and it's based on the amount of clean energy produced, and the investment tax credit is based on how much it costs you to build that facility. So this really applies to things like solar facilities, wind facilities, if you're generating electricity from flowing water, from waste from forest, and lots of other things that are clean sources. Oftentimes you can get a tax credit under Section 45 and 48 of the tax code. And the way the rules work right now is they relate only to specified types of resources. So again, like I said, solar, wind, biomass, things of that sort. But when we get to 2025, there are new rules under 48E and 45Y that expand the tax credit and make it available for any resource as long as you're creating zero GHG emissions. And so we're going to talk more about that. As Beth said, we have 3 sessions in this webinar series, and the third session will focus on these energy generation credits. And finally here, we have got clean fuels credits. And so these are for transportation fuels. And so they're really for producing or using fuels that replace diesel fuel or gasoline. And so historically, the way these fuels credits worked is they're available to companies or taxpayers that or others who take clean fuels and blend them into diesel fuel or gasoline. So it was a blending credit for blending it in. This becomes more available post IRA because a credit is available for someone who produces a clean fuel, whether that's something like ethanol or renewable diesel or any other new fuel that maybe we haven't even thought about today that is a low GHG fuel. And another category of clean fuels that's getting a lot of attention right now is hydrogen. And so there's a credit for producing hydrogen in the US. And all of these clean fuels have to be produced in the US in order to be entitled to those fuels, entitled to those tax credits. So that's just a general overview of the various tax credits that are now available under the IRA and have been expanded. And so those are the tax credits. Now the question is obviously, how do we get the benefit for those tax credits if we are talking about tribes that generally don't pay tax? And that's where I'm going to pass it over to Nicole to talk about that.
Great, thank you, Amish. One other thing I wanted to make a comment on, Amish gave you kind of a general overview of all of the many credits now included in the IRA. The other really nice thing, in addition to just the sheer variety, is that generally these tax credits are good for the next 10 years. So we have time to think and plan about how we're going to take advantage of it. Historically, we were getting in a situation often where Congress would extend a tax credit for a year or 2 years. And so that uncertainty, I think, created a lot of hesitation in the market. But now, as a result of the IRA, these tax credits have a long lead time. And I think this allows us the opportunity to be more thoughtful on how we take advantage of them. Amish gave you the general overview. I want to now tell you why tribes should really take a renewed interest, and that is because of direct pay. I'll note that some folks refer to this as elective pay, but we will use direct pay as probably, I think, the more accurate term. Certain entities do not pay federal income tax. That would include tribes. It would include state and local governments. It would include, for example, nonprofit hospitals. And so historically, tax credits were not of much interest. That is, there was no tax liability off which to use a credit. The IRA was a game changer in this regard. This is getting to why Amish was referring to it as really historic. What the IRA did was for certain entities, for certain generally tax exempt entities, which again includes tribal governments, they can elect for the first time ever to get directly paid the amount of the credit to which they are entitled. This is important because unlike, say, for example, grants or loans through the federal government, these tax credits, with that one exception that Amish mentioned on 48C, are unlimited. There's no competition here. The tribe would have to, of course, follow the rules to qualify for the credit. That is, they would have to build the facility or do the activity, as Amish referred to it. But then there is the opportunity to say, federal government, I would like my tax credit in the form, basically, of a check. And importantly, these are tax-free cash payments for direct pay. And for 12 of the IRA tax credits, this is available. And I should say this is generally available to tax-exempt entities. For-profit companies have other options, but it was limited. The IRA really limited this ability to take direct pay to a certain set of entities, of which tribes are one. So important to think about, okay, maybe my tribal government wasn't particularly interested before, but now, because of this opportunity to get direct payment, it's certainly time to reconsider and review the IRA tax credits and I think determine whether it might make sense to move forward. As I mentioned, to get this direct pay, we are going to have a deeper dive on this very topic. In addition to ensuring that the tribe qualifies for the tax credits by doing the underlying activity, there are certain rules around direct pay. There are certain registrations that have to be done, and there are certain IRS filings that have to be done to receive this direct payment. because there are a lot of rules, we're going to save that for a later webinar later this month to really dive deep into the mechanism behind direct pay. One thing I do want to note is that direct pay, we have the IRA and the statute. We do often need Treasury and IRS to give us guidance, for example, to tell us what forms need to be filed or tell us the rules of the road as they apply to tribal governments. Treasury and the IRS have issued proposed rules on direct pay, but have not finalized that rule. And the comment period by which stakeholders can provide comments is open. And there is a Dear Tribal letter out for comments as well. So certainly to the extent you are interested in direct pay, just know that there also is a government consultation process underway to make sure these rules that were proposed work for tribes. But again, this webinar is just to orient you generally to the IRA tax credits and this new opportunity to get direct payment. I want to show you, talk a little bit more about the investment tax credit and kind of show you how this direct payment would work. So Amish mentioned and we are also doing a deeper dive on the investment tax credit because I think it might be applicable to many. But the investment tax credit was a tax credit that has existed historically, but the IRA really supercharged it and changed it. And this is one tax credit, one of many, that a tribe can elect to get direct payment. So I wanted to go through the basics of the investment tax credit and what you would need to do to be eligible, and then show you an example of how to monetize through direct pay this valuable credit. So generally speaking, the investment tax credit is a tax credit for placing in service things that produce renewable energy. So prototypically, think about your solar panels or your wind turbines, or now energy storage projects. So it covers a decent size amount of projects, again, all producing renewable energy. The interesting thing about how the tax credits in the IRA worked is that it set different levels of their value. And we'll talk a little bit about how to get the most out of these tax credits in terms of value. But we've referred to the kind of the base credit of the investment tax credit. Again, if you qualify as 6% of the cost of that thing. So think about 6% of the cost of the solar panel. That's not a lot, it's certainly helpful. But what the IRA did is then on top of that 6% allowed the opportunity to get that value higher if certain conditions are met. One of the major ways to get your value higher is to follow certain labor conditions. So all of the different kind of bonus opportunities are in red on this slide, and Amish will walk us through them in greater detail. But the base credit for the investment tax credit, if you qualify as 6%, 30% if you meet certain labor conditions, and then you can keep getting it higher than 30% if some additional requirements, bonus requirements are met. This tax credit is claimed in the year the project is placed in service. And so now I want to show you an example of how the investment tax credit would work with the direct payment. So in a very simplistic example here, a tribe purchases and places in service solar panels to put on the roof of the administrative building. Solar panels are pretty expensive. In my example, they cost $500,000. Under the IRA, because this is an eligible project as an investment tax credit, the base credit of that would be 6%. So 6% off of $500,000, $30,000. But if certain labor conditions are met, that value goes up, or if it's a small project, I should say, up to 5-fold. Labor condition bonuses are really important to try to take advantage of because it increases your credit. There are additional bonuses amounts that, again, Amish will walk through. 10% if domestic content rules are met. An additional 10% if the project is placed in an energy community, and the additional 10 or 20% if the project is placed in a certain low-income community bonus program and an allocation is received for that. So if you do your math, there is a way to get to, of that $500,000 that this solar panel, that the federal government will basically subsidize 70% of that cost. And importantly, because this is a tribe in my example, there is the opportunity to elect direct payment and receive a check that is not subject to income taxation from the federal government. Again, the tribe has to meet the conditions to be eligible for the investment tax credit, and there are rules around that. And also the tribe has to meet the requirements to select direct payment through certain registration processes and through the filing of certain forms with the IRS. But hopefully through this example, you can see just how excited and why we're so excited and believe these tax credits, and on top of it, the ability to get direct payment for tribes really is pretty historic. I think in the next slide, Amish, you're going to talk about how to get the different additions.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. So, you know, as Nicole said, I mean, we're talking about a starting point of a 6% credit on an ITC all the way up to 70%. And the way we look at this is the first one that we think every project is, you know, definitely going to find a way to hit one way or another is the labor condition requirement, because that gets you from 6 to 30%. And I think most people who are looking to build these projects are looking to get at least the 30%. And so the way to get to 30%, and there are a few different ways to do this, is that if it's a small project, less than 1 megawatt, which is a relatively small project, then you automatically meet this requirement and you go from 6 to 30%. Or if you have a project that has already begun construction and began before a specific date, which was January 28th of 2023, then again, you automatically meet this requirement. And just on that point, a lot of people say, well, I haven't done anything yet to begin construction. I haven't started my project. I'm maybe hearing about ITCs for the first time today. And so there are some strategies to use equipment that was already developed in order to be treated as having begun construction earlier. And so there are some opportunities to still be treated as having begun construction back in January or earlier in order to be outside of these rules or automatically go from the 6 to the 30. But if you don't automatically go from 6 to 30, then the rule is you have to meet these requirements. And so what that means generally is that you have to pay prevailing wages, and this is under the Davis-Bacon Act kind of definitions, for on-site work. And so, you know, it's just a matter of, and this goes back to the comment I made earlier about these are some of the societal type benefits that are provided for in the IRA in addition to the climate change benefits. So this is making sure that people who are working on these projects are getting paid prevailing wages, and that they are, that's what you need to get from the 6 to the 30%. And so this applies to on-site work. And there's some rules around exactly how to determine what prevailing wages are, but there are rules that go back to Davis-Bacon rules that a lot of folks are familiar with, kind of predating the IRA, and so we look to those sort of rules. So that's the first part. The second part, so that's paying people prevailing wages, and the second is making sure that you have a certain amount of apprentices working on the project. And that's generally between 10 to 15% of the labor hours on a project, plus, you know, if you have 4 people working on a project, at least one has to be an apprentice. And this goes back to the idea of thinking about, as we look forward to building these projects, we want to make sure that we have a labor force that's well qualified and well trained to continue to build these projects. And so this is providing an incentive to make sure we're training apprentices, training folks to continue to build these projects. And so you have to meet both pay prevailing wages, and you have to meet the apprenticeship requirement and have the right number of apprentices. And if you do that, then you meet the labor condition requirement, you go from 6 to 30%. And so oftentimes we think of 30% as effectively the baseline because, again, we don't know of anyone really who was trying to hit the 6%. The 30% really is viewed as the minimum. So then everything else we look at as a bonus credit. And so when we look at the first bonus credit, it's a domestic content bonus credit. And this is a credit for using domestically produced, US produced products, components and products in your facility. And so this really applies to the ITC, as Nicole was talking about before, and a few other of the tax credits around producing clean energy. And so the IRS has released some guidance on what it means to produce domestic content. We won't get too far into that guidance, but the thing to think about here is one of the things the IRA is trying to do is to increase US manufacturing capabilities for clean energy components. And it's doing it on the one hand by incentivizing folks to build manufacturing facilities in which clean energy components are produced. And those are those incentives are the ones we talked about before, the 48C and the 45X. So that incentivizes the supply side of the chain. On the demand side of the chain, it incentivizes developers of renewable energy projects to want to use domestically produced components by providing this 10% additional tax credit. The energy community bonus is another potential 10%, and these are all stacked on top of each other. So we can go from 30% to 40% to 50% for the energy community bonus, but you don't have to have both energy community and domestic content to get either one. So the energy community bonus is trying to incentivize developers of these projects to build these projects in certain communities. And these include communities where coal mines or coal electric generation facilities have closed down. They are in brownfield sites, and there's a particular definition around brownfield sites, and certain lower income communities that have suffered job losses. And if you build in these communities, then you can get an additional 10% credit. And so again, this is intended to incentivize making sure that we're not just building in the places we've historically been building, but incentivizing in the construction of facilities in places where you might not otherwise build these for lots of reasons. So the last is the low-income community credit program bonus. And so we, for that one, this is again, like the 48C bonus, where you have to actually go to the IRS in order to get an allocation of this credit. So energy community, if you do the activity, you get it. Domestic content, if you do the activity, you get it. ITC, if you do the activity, you get it. Low-income communities, there's a limited amount, and you have to get an allocation of this tax credit. But if you get an allocation, then you are incentivized to, and obviously very, very relevant here, to build on Indian lands, to build in certain low-income communities, and then that can get a 10% additional bonus. And then if you build in places where you're building on residential housing, or you're building in the benefits are going to certain low-income users of the power, then you can get an additional 10% so that you're at a 20% allocation. So that's, again, mathematically how we can get from 6% all the way up to 70% if you stack all of these credits together. With that, I think, Ken, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Amish. So I'm going to be talking about 179D, which is a tax deduction rather than a tax credit. But before I did that, I just wanted, as a transition, to talk a little bit about what Amish, Nicole, and the others were discussing. And in particular, how Amish mentioned at the beginning of his portion of the presentation that these credits have been around for a long time to encourage these types of energy investments. But what's different now is that tribes can directly benefit. But I wanted to note that in the past, it was possible for tribal governments to benefit from these credits, but you had to use complicated third-party structures, which took away some of the value for the tribe, also made it more complicated and tribes less likely to do it. Now you don't need to use those complicated structures, what I think from a tribal perspective really promotes your sovereignty and self-determination. So that's another reason I find these tax credits very exciting for tribes with the direct pay. So with that, I wanted to launch into the discussion of tax deduction under 179D. So what this is an incentive to put like qualified energy efficient property onto buildings, or retrofit or put new property onto buildings. And what this does is it gives you a tax deduction as opposed to a tax credit. And what the difference is a credit. All the things that Nicole and Amish were talking about are $1 for $1, dollar for dollar. You have $1 of credit, you get $1 back from the federal government. A deduction is a little less valuable because it reduces your income and you get the benefit of that through your tax rate. So for example, the deduction we're all familiar with on the individual basis is the charitable contribution deduction. When we make a $100 donation to a charity, we can reduce our individual tax bills by $100, our taxable income by $100, which has a $35 benefit to us. So that's the difference between a deduction and a credit. So a little less valuable, but still important. So let's talk about it. So this is under 179D of the Internal Revenue Code, and that's been around for a long time, but it was difficult for tribes to unlock the benefits here until amendments were made with the Inflation Reduction Act. So you can get a deduction for installing qualified energy efficient property that reduces a building's annual energy costs. 25%, it has to be a reduction in annual energy costs. The property that you can do are interior lighting systems, HVAC, hot water, improvements to the building's envelope. So as I was mentioning, that it is a deduction as opposed to a credit, but the value of it can actually, if some of the labor conditions and other things that Amish and Nicole were talking about are satisfied, you can get up to $5 per square foot of the building area. So we can see how that deduction works in an example on the next page. So if a tribe spends $100,000 for energy efficient building property, like a cooling system on an existing building, and it meets the labor conditions that Amish was talking about, you could get on this property $100,000 deduction. So the whole property, you could deduct it from the tax bill. Now note, in this example, the building is 200,000 square feet. We have a $5 deduction per square foot, but 5 times 200,000 is too much because the deduction is limited by the cost of the property. So that's in small print there. That limits the deduction to the cost of the property, but still we've got a $100,000 deduction here. So then the question is, well, you know, like with tax credits, we're a tribe, we don't pay taxes. How do we get the benefit? And with the credit, Treasury has created a system by which you can apply for the credit by filing a tax form, even though you don't usually file a tax return. Here, you don't have an income tax liability, and that's how tax deductions work. So how do you benefit? You have to allocate it to the architect in this particular example. So the architect gets the benefit of the deduction, which reduces your costs of that property. So moving on to the next slide, after giving that example of a deduction, I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about some opportunities that you have to leverage the benefits in these tax credits and tax deductions with other money that might be available to you. And this is what I think is really exciting about the Inflation Reduction Act, especially when you consider the other opportunities in the Inflation Reduction Act, such as the fiscal recovery funds that you may have received or the ARPA grant opportunities. So there are ways to combine these things that are really exciting, I think. So what I point out in this first bullet is that you can actually use the money from the federal government that you've received to build something that you ultimately receive a tax credit for. So you can net your tribe money by doing these projects. And actually, a lot of these projects that tribes are considering, I've been talking to our clients, they were already thinking about doing things like charging stations, or they've been upgrading their HVAC systems or thinking about doing that in response to COVID. And they might be using the state and local fiscal recovery funds for that. So again, there are ways to get the tax credit, even though you're using federal funds. So I think that that's really exciting. There are also other ways to use, to combine grants and forgivable loans with the tax credits. Sometimes those can be limited in how you could do that. That's a little more complicated to get into now, but I just wanted to flag that for you. So a real quick example here, kind of using what I just talked about on the earlier slide. We've got a tribal government that's Now we tell you the source of the money, that it's using fiscal recovery funds to construct a new administrative building. If that building is qualified energy efficient property, the tribe's cost for the building would be reduced this due to the 179D deduction, freeing up funding for other projects. So you use that money from your fiscal recovery funds that you got from the federal government. It reduced the bill for the property because you got this 179D deduction, and now you have more money that you can use another way. And by the way, that wouldn't be limited because it's no longer fiscal recovery funds. So it's just money back from the government, and it's not going to be subject to the requirements of the ARPA requirements on those funds. So I wanted to mention that as just kind of exciting opportunities that we're just exploring. And also, whenever you're thinking about a project as a tribe these days, I think first you want to ask yourself, is there free money available from the government in the form of fiscal recovery funds or ARPA grants to look at these projects? And then as a next step, we've got this money. Is there an opportunity to get even more money back from the government in the form of either this deduction that I was just talking about or the tax credits that Amish and Nicole were talking about? So a lot to think about, but really exciting. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. I want to, before we go into your Q&As, and please, again, put your questions and answers, or at least put your questions in the Q&A. We'll turn off the recording and answer them the best we can. But again, we wanted to purposely leave a lot of time. This is pretty dense information so that we can answer your questions. The other area of tax credits that I wanted to just mention in a very summary way are the tax credits around electrification of vehicles. And I added them kind of at the last minute of this presentation, just because I thought they might be of interest to some of you. And Amish mentioned the EV vehicle tax credit at the outset. This is, I think, significant because we do have a lot of clients who are interested in replacing their fleets, for example. And this may be where kind of the tax credit can tip a decision-making towards an EV vehicle. The tax credit is available for some of your smaller vehicles, but is also now available for your bigger vehicles, and also available for mobile machinery. And as you can see from that slide, again, this tax credit, like many of the other tax credits that we mentioned at the outset, can be pretty valuable. The maximum under the EV vehicle tax credit is $40,000 per vehicle. And so you could imagine, again, a scenario, it would have to kind of align, but a scenario where replacing a fleet of vehicles with electric vehicles could be really beneficial to the tribe. The other tax credit worth mentioning and relates to the first one that I just talked about is the tax credit for EV charging. This could, for example, be EV charging infrastructure for those vehicles that you just purchased with your tax credit, or they could be places where you're encouraging visitors, tourism, to stay a while and charge up. This EV charging infrastructure tax credit has existed again for a while, but the IRA really supercharged its value, and the credit is now up to $100,000 per single unit. The one caveat here I would have is that they have to be in certain locations. And if they are not in these eligible census tracts, the credit is not at all available. And that is, again, one area where we're kind of awaiting guidance from Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service about where are these eligible census tracts. Because again, you could imagine having a facility where you set up several chargers, and being able to reap quite a significant benefit with this tax credit. That covers, I think, all of our substantive information. Again, I appreciate it was a lot, but I'm going to go to the Q&As, but first we're going to, Molly, stop the recording. Is that correct? Wrap us up.
Great. Thanks, Nicole, and everyone from Holland and Knight for all that great information, and to Howie for opening it up for us today. Hopefully we were able to answer a lot of your questions during this webinar, but if I'm sure there are still lots of questions to come, and we will be going into a little more detail in the next two webinars. Just a reminder, they're listed here. August 28 will be, as Nicole just said, more on the mechanisms of direct pay. And on September 25th, we'll be going more into the investment tax credit and production tax credit. But if you still need additional help to take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act, I wanted to put a little more information up here about how you can apply for direct pro bono legal assistance through Stanford's Lawyers for a Sustainable Economy initiative. The intake application is on our website here at lawyersforsustainability.com. And the process is pretty simple. So you go onto the website, fill out the intake form, and then we would follow up with the potential client to do an initial screening on eligibility. If you're eligible, we would then try to connect the client with a firm. Once that connection is made, a conversation needs to happen between the firm and the prospective client, just talking about the potential scope of the relationship, why the potential client is not in a position to pay for legal services, and figuring out whether the law firm has any conflicts or is otherwise unable to take on the representation. So ultimately, while we do a pre-screening here, each firm will independently determine on a case-by-case basis if a potential client fits within the firm's pro bono policy. And our website also has additional details on eligibility. And so just in closing, I want to thank Holland and Knight for all of the great substantive information today and all of the other firms listed here that sponsor the Lawyers for a Sustainable Economy initiative and have done a lot of this important pro bono work. You can reach out to me at the website or the email listed here if you have any questions. And we did get a couple questions in the chat about whether we'll be posting these slides and the recording. We will post them on the website, and I'll send links around to all the participants as well. And I think that's all we've got. We look forward to seeing you at the next two webinars and to hopefully answering more of your questions then. Thank you.